Angela felt a rush of relief and gratitude, but before she could respond, the woman in red continued. "We're not asking you to abandon your business," she said, "but we want to stay in touch. There are leadership programs, advisory roles, and even mentorship opportunities where your voice would be valuable. Think about it." Angela nodded slowly. She had spent so much of her life trying to break down barriers as she had never considered the possibility of helping build something better from the inside. Maybe this wasn't just about her loan, maybe it was about something much bigger. After a few more minutes of discussion, Angela stood and shook hands with each board member. The entire meeting had taken a turn she hadn't expected, but in the end, she had walked away not just with financial backing for her business, but with something even more valuable: respect, recognition, and the possibility of a future where she could create real change. As she stepped out of the conference room, the bank manager was nowhere in sight. The staff at the front desk, now visibly more attentive, straightened up as she walked past. The receptionist, the same one who had ignored her for hours, offered a hesitant smile. Angela didn't need an apology. She had already won. She exited the bank, stepping into the fresh air, and took a deep breath. The day hadn't gone the way she had planned, but maybe that was the beauty of it. Sometimes, the unexpected challenges led to the most powerful breakthroughs. As she walked toward her car, her phone buzzed with a new email, confirmation of her loan approval. She smiled, shaking her head slightly. This was just the beginning. It started as just another day for Angela Thomas. Dressed in a crisp navy blue suit, she stepped into the grand lobby of Crestwood Bank, holding a neatly organized folder in her hands. She had an appointment, one she had scheduled well in advance. Angela was there to discuss a business loan, something she had worked tirelessly for. Her business was growing, and this meeting was supposed to be a turning point. But as she approached the front desk, she felt something shift in the air. The receptionist barely looked at her, offering only a forced smile before asking her to take a seat. At first, Angela didn't think much of it. Banks could be slow, and she was prepared to wait a little. But as the minutes turned into an hour, she started to notice the pattern. Other customers, mostly well-dressed men and women, came in after her and were ushered in almost immediately. Some of them didn't even have appointments. She watched as the bank manager, a man in his mid-50s with slicked-back hair and a sharp suit, greeted them warmly, shaking hands and laughing as he personally walked them into his office. Still, Angela waited. An hour and a half passed. Then, too, her patience wore thin. She approached the receptionist again, her voice calm but firm, asking about the delay. The young woman behind the desk shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the manager's office before mumbling that it shouldn't be much longer. But Angela could see it now. This wasn't a simple scheduling mistake. She was being ignored. She took a deep breath, reminding herself why she was here. Angela had built her business from the ground up. She had prepared every document they could possibly need, had a solid financial plan, and was more than qualified for the loan she was requesting. Yet here she was, being made to feel invisible. Just as she was about to gather her things and leave, the heavy glass doors at the entrance swung open. A group of sharply dressed individuals stepped in, their presence commanding immediate attention. The entire mood in the bank shifted. The staff straightened up, whispers passed between employees, and even the bank manager himself rushed out of his office, his confident smirk replaced with something else: concern. And that's when Angela saw it. The bank manager's eyes landed on her, widening slightly as if a realization had just struck him. Because the people who had just walked in weren't ordinary customers. They were the bank's board members, and in that moment, everything changed. Angela sat still, watching the scene unfold, her fingers tightening around the folder in her lap. The air in the bank had shifted completely. Where moments ago she had been invisible, suddenly she wasn't. The board members, a group of distinguished men and women, walked in with purpose. Their expensive suits and confident strides commanded attention. Employees who had been busy pretending not to notice Angela just moments before now looked alert, scrambling to greet the powerful figures. The bank manager, the very man who had ignored her for 2 hours, suddenly seemed nervous. His confident smirk was gone, replaced by a tight, uneasy expression. He stepped forward quickly, past Angela, as if trying to regain control of the situation before anyone could notice what had just been happening in his lobby. "Welcome, welcome," he said, his voice a little too eager as he extended his hand to the first board member in line. "We weren't expecting you this early." What a pleasant surprise. Angela watched carefully. She wasn't the only one who noticed the shift in his behavior. One of the board members, an older gentleman with silver hair and a sharp gaze, barely reacted to the manager's outstretched hand. Instead, his eyes swept across the room before landing on her. His expression changed, just slightly, but Angela caught it. He had seen her sitting there, and he had noticed the way the bank staff had been acting before they arrived. She sat up straighter, adjusting her posture. If there was ever a moment to make her presence known, it was now. But before she could say a word, another board member, a woman in a deep red blazer, spoke. "Who's been helping this young lady?" she asked, her tone polite but firm. The bank manager's shoulders stiffened. He hesitated for half a second too long. That's when Angela realized something. He hadn't expected them to notice her at all. The receptionist, still behind the desk, glanced at her manager, waiting for a cue. The silence stretched just a second too long. Then, as if snapping back into character, the manager forced a chuckle. "Oh, Miss Thomas. Of course, we were just about to bring her in," he said, turning to Angela with a tight smile. "Apologies for the wait. Things have been a little hectic today." Angela didn't move. She met his eyes, unblinking. For 2 hours, she had been ignored. But now suddenly, her presence mattered. And she could tell the board members weren't convinced by his performance. The older man with silver hair stepped forward. "Miss Thomas, is that right?" he asked. His voice was steady, but there was something in his tone, something deeper, as if he already knew the answer to the question he was about to ask next. "How long have you been waiting?" Angela exhaled slowly. This was it, the moment that would change everything. Angela met the older man's gaze. For a brief moment, she considered downplaying it, making it seem like the wait hadn't been as bad as it was. But why should she? She had been patient, polite, and prepared. And yet, she had been dismissed, overlooked as if she didn't belong. She straightened her shoulders. 2 hours, she said simply, her voice calm but firm. A small, heavy silence followed. The bank manager let out a forced laugh, shifting on his feet. "Well, I wouldn't say." 2 hours? The woman in the red blazer interrupted. Her expression remained neutral, but Angela could hear the sharpness in her tone. "That's quite a wait, especially for someone with an appointment." Angela noticed how the other employees were suddenly looking anywhere but at her. The receptionist lowered her gaze, pretending to shuffle papers. A security guard near the entrance cleared his throat awkwardly. It was clear. Everyone knew what had been happening, but no one had expected her to say it out loud. The bank manager's face tightened. "I assure you, there was no intentional delay," he said quickly. "We've just been extremely busy today, and..." "Busy?" The older man's tone was deceptively mild. "Then I assume all of these other customers," he gestured toward the now empty waiting area, "also waited 2 hours." Angela didn't have to say another word. The truth was already out, hanging heavy in the air. For the first time, the manager looked nervous. His fingers twitched slightly at his sides, as if debating whether to fold his arms or keep them relaxed. He opened his mouth, probably to spin another excuse, but one of the other board members, a man in a charcoal grey suit, spoke up. "Miss Thomas," he said, turning his full attention to her, "would you mind stepping into the conference room with us? I'd love to hear more about why you're here today." Angela blinked, caught slightly off guard by how quickly things had shifted. She glanced at the bank manager, whose face had gone slightly pale, then back at the board member. "I'd be happy to," she said. The manager looked like he wanted to protest, but he knew better. The decision had already been made. Angela gathered her things and followed the board members as they made their way toward a set of sleek glass doors. As she stepped inside, she had one thought. Whatever was about to happen next, the bank manager wasn't going to like it. Angela stepped into the conference room, her heartbeat steady but her mind racing. The space was large, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a long polished table in the center, and chairs neatly arranged around it. It was clear this room was reserved for serious discussions, the kind where big decisions were made. The board members took their seats, and Angela found herself sitting directly across from the older man with silver hair. His eyes, sharp and calculating, studied her with quiet interest. The bank manager hesitated at the door, as if unsure whether he should enter. His usual confidence had cracked, and now he looked like a man trying to regain control of a situation slipping through his fingers. The woman in the red blazer glanced at him before gesturing toward an empty seat. "You should sit down," she said, her voice even. It wasn't a suggestion. Reluctantly, he obeyed. Angela could almost see the gears turning in his mind, trying to figure out a way to fix whatever damage had just been done, but it was too late. The man in the grey suit leaned forward. "Miss Thomas, let's start with the basics. Tell us about your business." Angela nodded and opened her folder. She had prepared for this conversation, just not under these circumstances. She explained her company, its growth, the financials, the loan she was requesting, and why it made sense for the bank to approve it. She spoke with confidence, her voice steady. As she spoke, she noticed something. The board members were listening, truly listening. They weren't dismissive, they weren't rushing her, and they certainly weren't making her feel like she didn't belong. It was the complete opposite of how the bank manager had treated her just minutes ago. On the screen was a breakdown of customer service records, timestamps of appointments, how long each client waited, and a comparison of how other applicants had been treated that day. Angela's name was there, standing out like a glaring mistake, but that wasn't the only thing. There were patterns, clear, undeniable ones. Certain clients, those who looked a certain way, those who fit a certain image, were given priority, regardless of appointment times. Others, like Angela, had been made to wait. A thick silence settled over the room. The bank manager swallowed hard. "I can explain." "I don't think you can," the older man said, his voice cold. "This is unacceptable." Angela's heart pounded as she watched the moment unfold. The weight of what had just been revealed settled over the room like a storm. It wasn't just about her loan anymore. It was about something bigger, something systemic. The woman in red nodded toward the manager. "You need to step out," she said firmly. "Now." For a second, it seemed like he might argue. But then, as if realizing he had no escape, he pushed back his chair and stood. His face was pale, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the room. Angela let out a slow breath. The tension in her chest loosened slightly, but she knew this wasn't over yet. The older man turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "Miss Thomas, let's get back to your loan application." Angela nodded, steadying herself. She had walked into this bank expecting a battle. She hadn't expected to expose something much bigger. But just as she thought the worst was over, the woman in red spoke again. "One more thing, Miss Thomas," she said, leaning forward. "Have you ever considered a leadership role in the financial sector?" Angela blinked. "What?" The woman smiled slightly. "Because I think we might have a much bigger opportunity for you." Angela had come in for a loan, but she might be walking out with something much more powerful. Angela sat still for a moment, unsure if she had heard correctly. A leadership role. She had come into this bank to fight for the loan she rightfully deserved, but now the conversation had taken an entirely different turn. She studied the woman in red, trying to gauge if this was just a polite offer or something serious. But there was no hesitation in her expression. She meant it. Angela cleared her throat, keeping her voice steady. "I'm listening." The older man smiled slightly, folding his hands on the table. "It's clear you're not just an ambitious entrepreneur," he said. "You're a woman who understands resilience, patience, and leadership. You came in here prepared, you handled yourself with grace under pressure, and whether you realized it or not, you just uncovered a serious problem within this branch." The woman in red nodded. "And we need people like you in leadership. People who don't just accept things as they are but challenge them when necessary." Angela felt a strange mix of emotions: pride, disbelief, and a hint of cautious optimism. She had spent years fighting for her business, for opportunities that should have come easier but never did. She had learned to advocate for herself, to stay prepared, and to never back down when faced with challenges. And now, those very qualities were being recognized in a way she had never expected. She exhaled slowly. "I appreciate the offer," she said carefully, "but I'm here today for my business. My focus has always been on building it, growing it, and making it successful." The older man exchanged a glance with the others before nodding. "Understood, and we'll start with that." He gestured toward the folder Angela had brought in. "Your loan is approved. In fact, based on your financials and the strength of your proposal, we're willing to offer you better terms than what you initially requested." When she finished, the older man sat back, folding his hands together. "Everything you've presented is impressive. Your business is strong, and this loan is well structured. So tell me, Miss Thomas, was there any reason given for the delay today?" Angela hesitated, glancing briefly at the bank manager. His jaw was tight, his fingers clenched together on the table. His face had lost most of its color. He knew what was coming. She met the older man's gaze again. "No," she said. "I was asked to wait. No explanation, no updates. I watched other customers, who arrived after me, be helped immediately. When I asked about the delay, I was told it shouldn't be much longer." The tension in the room thickened. The woman in red let out a slow breath, exchanging a look with the others. The older man finally turned to the bank manager. "Is that so?" The manager opened his mouth, but no words came out. Angela could see it, the panic creeping in, the realization that there was no way to spin this. The silence stretched, heavy and unrelenting. Then the older man spoke again, his tone calm but firm. "I think we need to have a conversation about how this branch is being run." Angela didn't move, but inside she knew something big was about to happen. The room fell into an uneasy silence, the weight of the older man's words pressing down like a storm about to break. The bank manager swallowed hard, his usual arrogance now replaced for something else: fear. Angela watched him closely, waiting for his response. But before he could say anything, the woman in the red blazer spoke again, her voice calm but laced with authority. "I'd like to know," she said, folding her hands on the table, "if this is a pattern at this branch, or if Miss Thomas was just an exception." Angela felt a shift in the air. This wasn't just about her loan anymore. This was bigger. The board members weren't just questioning the delay, they were questioning the entire operation of this branch. And judging by the nervous look on the bank manager's face, he knew it too. He let out a stiff chuckle, shaking his head. "I can assure you, this was just an unfortunate mix-up, nothing more." "Is that so?" the older man said, tilting his head slightly. Then, without breaking eye contact, he reached into his suit pocket, pulled out his phone, and tapped the screen a few times. The room was so quiet that the faint sound of typing seemed deafening. Angela glanced at the other board members. None of them looked convinced. Then the older man placed his phone face down on the table. "Let's see if that's true." The bank manager shifted uncomfortably. "What do you mean?" "I just sent a message to our compliance team," the older man said, his tone casual. "They have access to all customer service records, call logs, appointment schedules, security footage, everything." He leaned back in his chair. "If this was just an innocent mistake, I'm sure they'll confirm that shortly." Angela felt the tension in the room tighten like a rope being pulled. The bank manager's face turned an even paler shade. He tried to keep his expression neutral, but the slight twitch of his jaw gave him away. A few seconds later, his phone vibrated against the table. He glanced down at it and stiffened. Whatever message he had just received, it wasn't good. The woman in red tapped her nails against the table. Well, the bank manager cleared his throat. He hesitated. His eyes darted toward Angela, then back to the board members. For the first time, he looked truly trapped. Angela knew, in that moment, that whatever secrets he had been trying to hide, they were about to come out. The bank manager's fingers hovered over his phone, his face frozen in a tight, unreadable expression. Angela could see the battle happening inside his head. Whatever message he had just received, it wasn't something he wanted to share, but he had no choice. Everyone in the room was waiting. With a forced cough, he straightened his tie and looked up. There seems to have been some inconsistencies in how appointments were handled today, he admitted, his voice strained. The older man raised an eyebrow. Inconsistencies? The bank manager shifted in his chair. It looks like there was a mix-up with scheduling and… That's enough, the woman in red cut in. She had been watching him closely, her sharp eyes missing nothing. The report came back, didn't it? He hesitated for a second too long. The older man exhaled and picked up his phone. He glanced at the screen, then turned it around for everyone to see. Angela leaned forward slightly, her pulse quickening.